Welcome to the Door Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today in episode 340, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is how to figure out how much you can spend in retirement. It's a topic that's important, obviously, to those, old folks like me who are either in retirement or near retirement. But it's an important topic for folks that might be decades or more away from retirement. And here's why. Understanding how much we can spend in retirement, how much, for example, each year we can take out of our investments, helps us figure out from a planning perspective how much we need to accumulate in order to retire. So that's the topic. It comes from questions from the Facebook group. Recall that I put out a request for questions and topics, and you guys, as always, did not disappoint. I've got dozens of questions. I think it'll take me all through 2021 probably to answer them all, maybe longer, we'll see. But let me read you this question, and it's really short. It comes from a member of the Door Roller Facebook group named John, and John writes simply, withdrawal strategies for retirement. I like it. Clear, concise, right to the point. So by the way, if you're not a member of the Facebook group, you can join doorroller.net/Facebook group. I think we're up to about 10,000 folks in that group. It's extremely active, both for those that want to ask questions, and please don't be intimidated. Don't think your question is silly or whatever. And for those that want to contribute, and maybe you want to do both, it's a very active and I think very useful and helpful community that continues to grow. I'm very proud of it in a good way. And it sort of lifted the burden of me feeling like I had to answer all these questions, because depending on the question, there are folks in this group that know a lot more about some of this stuff than I do. And so it's wonderful to see that come together. Anyway, that's the question. And so what I want to do today is sort of walk through pretty quickly, and I hopefully in a somewhat easy to follow way, how I think through this issue. And I want to start with what's called the 4% rule. You've probably heard of it. It's a rule that comes out of a paper published in 1994 by a certified financial planner by the name of William Bengen. And the 4% rule is pretty straightforward. What it says is, in year one of retirement, you can spend 4% of whatever you've set aside for retirement. Now, you may have Social Security, you may have a pension, you may have a side income, side job. That's great. But in terms of what you've got in terms for retirement savings, and it doesn't have to be in a retirement account. You may save for retirement, certainly in a 401k or IRA, but you also may save for retirement in a taxable account. You may have some of it in a CD, some of it in a savings account. It doesn't matter where it's located. You add up all of it and you simply multiply by 4%. So just to keep the math easy, if you had $1 million, 4%, under the 4% rule, you could spend $40,000 in year one. And this is the important part, after the first year, you throw out the 4% rule, or I shouldn't say the 4% rule, you throw out the 4%. You only use that to determine your spending in year one. In years 2 through, hopefully many for you, 50 years, however long, what you'll do is you'll take whatever you withdrew the previous year and adjust it for inflation, or I suppose decrease it if there's deflation. So our 40 grand in year one, if the inflation rate's 2%, in year two, you'd take out, I think, $40,800 if I'm doing the math correctly. And then in year three, you'd simply multiply 40,800 by whatever the inflation rate is, and you'd increase your amount by that much. So that's it, the 4% rule. And it's fairly straightforward. However, if you don't know how Bengen actually derived the rule, and you don't know the assumptions that he used, you could mess things up. And I'll give you an example. Many folks today say, wait a minute, the 4% rule can't possibly work in today's environment. Stocks are at all-time highs. They're certainly going to come down eventually. And look at yields. Bonds aren't yielding what they used to. So maybe the 4% rule should be 3.5 or 3 or 2.5. That kind of argument, I think, displays a fundamental misunderstanding of what Bengen did. And let me just walk through quickly what he did. In his initial paper, he said, I want to look at retirements beginning in 1926. He went all the way back to 1926. And he said, okay, I want to use actual market data, both stock returns and bond returns, and actual inflation rates. We have all that historical data. And I'm going to actually map it out. I'm going to imagine, I don't want to use averages. I don't want to guess. I'm going to actually see how retirement would have worked out for someone retiring in 1926. How long would their money have lasted? And he looked out 50 years. He stopped after year 50 because his theory was, we're probably not still alive after 50 years of retirement. By the way, the FIRE movement, I don't think existed in 1994. We'll put the FIRE movement aside for the moment. He looked at 50 years. And of course, he had to make an assumption about how much they were going to take out in year one. The 4% rule didn't exist. So he actually looked at a range of initial withdrawal rates from 1% to 8%. And his primary asset allocation was 50% stocks and 50% intermediate term treasury bonds. And he rebalanced every year. And he just did the math. And he calculated, okay, for 1926, they could have taken out X percent. And his goal, the way he defined success was whether their money lasted at least 30 years. And the idea for that was it's just a traditional retirement. You're retiring 65, you're dead by 95, to be blunt, okay? But he looked out 50 years, but he defined success as lasting at least 30 years. So he did that for 1926. And then he did it all over again for 1927 and 1928, all the way through 1976. Now, if you think about 1976, he's looking out 50 years. So 1976, well, wait a minute, there's a problem. He wrote this paper in 94. He didn't have 50 years of data. And so for any years after 92, he had to use averages. He used 3% for inflation, a little over 10% for stocks, a little over 5% for bonds. But for many of the years, beginning in 1926, for example, he had obviously 50 years of historical data. And by the way, he and others have since updated this analysis, and it hasn't changed. But here's the real important thing is that for each year from 1926 to 1976, I'll call it the safe withdrawal rate, the percentage you could have taken out in year one, and then adjusted it for inflation thereafter, without running out of money for at least 30 years, it changed. It wasn't the same. And that makes sense because there's different markets up and down, there's different inflation rates. But here's what a lot of people don't understand. How did he take all of those different percentages? And by the way, some were as high as 10%. Can you imagine an initial withdrawal rate of 10%? How did he come up with 4%? Like, was it an average? What math did he do? Well, what he did was he just took the worst year. He said, hey, okay, this year is 7%, that one's 8, that one's 5, this one's 10. 1966, that's the fly in the ointment. That was the bad year, 4%. Actually, it might have been closer to 4.1%, but whatever. That was the worst year. And he said, okay, the goal here is to be safe. We don't want to, yes, you could take out more, maybe you get lucky, but the problem is when you start to retire, you don't know what the next 30 to 50 years are going to be like. You don't know, am I retiring in a year when I could have taken 10%? Or am I retiring in a year when I can only take 4% or something in between? So what he said was, look, if you're concerned about what he called portfolio longevity, it's a fancy way of saying you're worried about going broke in retirement, 4% is the answer. And voila, we now have the 4% rule. But there's a lot of important sort of additional conclusions that we can walk through in light of the methodology that he used, right? I'll give you an example. I hear a lot of people say that they're going to use the bucket strategy, which I've talked about in the past, and initially I really liked. I don't now. I will not use the bucket strategy. Maybe that's a whole nother video or another podcast. But one of the reasons is because it addresses sequence of returns risk. The risk that you retire and the market goes, right? And inflation goes sky high. It addresses the sequence of returns risk because if we have another 2008, a couple of years into retirement, you've got this cash bucket of 1 or 2 years, 3 years. You've got a bond bucket of whatever, 5, 6, 7, 8 years to cushion the blow. And so during a really bad market, you don't have to sell stocks. And that intuitively, that makes sense. I think it's why I initially initially bought into it, but there's two problems with it. The first is the 4% rule already insulates us from the sequence of returns risk. It does so because he picked the worst possible year. He said, this is the worst possible sequence of returns you could imagine. Now, some could say, well, it could get worse. That's true. It could always get worse. But 1966, 1968, the worst kind of sequence of returns risk that has happened in 100 years. It can always get worse, right? No matter what spending policy in retirement we dream up, it can always get worse. But boy, I mean, if we're trying to be reasonable about it, I mean, he's already given us a methodology that addresses the worst possible sequence of returns. And just to put that into some perspective, the reason the late 60s were so bad was not actually because of the late 60s. It was because of the early 70s. 73, 74 was probably the worst 2-year time period ever because the market was down and inflation was sky high. And folks don't remember, I did an article in Forbes the other day about mortgage rates. They hit a 50-year low. And I looked at some historical data. And in the early 80s now, still dealing with inflation, mortgage rates were 18%. I mean, it's just hard. We don't, we know historically, if we study it, that that's true. But it's really hard to wrap our minds around it. I mean, a typical mortgage that would cost $1,000 a month now for, say, $300,000 mortgage at 18% would cost $4,000 a month. I mean, it was a totally different world. Could we get to that again someday? Sure. Could it be worse? Of course, anything can always. I'm a big believer that it can always get worse. But trust me, the bucket strategy ain't going to save you anymore. I mean, so the point is, the 4% rule is by the way it was constructed, protects us from sequence of returns risk. Some might argue too much, right? Because you're just taking you're just assuming the absolute worst. All right. That's the first thing that I think the bucket strategy misses, those adherents to the bucket strategy. The second thing is, they say, well, it helps you avoid selling stocks, but in a bad market, the problem is that's not we want to be buying stocks in a bad market, right? We don't want to just not be selling them. And your standard asset allocation does that. You have a 60-40 allocation, let's say, stocks are down, so you're at 55-45, and you rebalance. What have you done? You've sold bonds, bought stocks. And you do that in retirement just like you do before retirement. And, it doesn't really matter from an asset allocation perspective where you pull your money out of, because let's say you take your money out once a year and then you rebalance. So it doesn't matter if you take it out of stocks or bonds, you rebalance. It goes back to the right asset allocation, whatever you've decided on. So, and back to the 4% rule, that's exactly what he assumed. He didn't use some sort of bucket strategy, right? And that's where understanding how he determined the 4% rule can help us in other related areas. For example, evaluating critically the bucket strategy. So then all of that raises the question you get a lot, is it still valid today, as I mentioned earlier? And it absolutely is. Yes, bond yields are low, stock prices are high. On the positive side, inflation is really low. That's really a recipe for the 4% rule. I mean, it's that kind of environment where the 4% rule works quite well. And in fact, some would argue it's really now a 4.5% rule. Again, understanding why, we got to understand what Bengen did in 1994. His asset allocation was 50% stocks, S&P 500, 50% intermediate term bonds. Since then, he's done additional research and he's found, what? If instead of having 50% in large cap, you have 30% in large cap and 20% in small cap, the 4% rule really becomes about 4.5%, right? So those problems that people want to throw at the 4% rule, given the current environment, I think just if you understand the history of the markets and inflation and how Bengen's rule, how he came up with it, and that he took the absolute worst case scenario, I have absolutely no concerns with the validity of the 4, or if you want to call it the 4.5% rule as it exists today. But it does raise some other questions. And I think this gets to the question at hand. We know, let's assume 1966 was the absolute worst year, and that's where the 4% rule came from. If you go back even further, you'll find years where you could have taken out 10% in the first year. Actually, one of them is 1877. Kind of hard to imagine that, but turns out it's true. There were some years in the 20s and the 50s that were 10% or thereabouts as well. But it raises a really important question, both from a planning perspective and I think even more so spending decisions in retirement. How do we know if we're retiring in a 1966 or we're retiring in an 1877? I mean, wouldn't it be nice to know that ahead of time? Because then we could maybe change our spending decisions or planning decisions. Wouldn't it be nice if you could assume from a planning perspective that you could spend 10% of your nest egg in year one? Now, let me first give you the bad news. There is no way in the world to know if you're going to retire in a year that's like 1966 or a year that's like 1877. It's just not possible, right? We just can't know the future. Now, there's been some really good work. Kitces, and I never know if I pronounce his name right, Kitces. I need to email him and ask him. He's a certified financial planner, does great work around retirement. And he's done some interesting analysis that pairs the stock market valuations based on the Shiller PE, which is a 10-year sort of average PE, if you will. And the correlation between stock valuations and the initial safe withdrawal rate. And of course, as you might imagine, the higher the initial valuations, stock valuations when you retire, based on the Shiller PE, the lower your safe withdrawal rate. Which kind of means if we're coming out of a prolonged bull market, your safe withdrawal rate's probably lower. Why? Because we're likely to hit a bear market, the kind of thing we've all kind of been waiting for, at least I have, for years now. And if we're in a real bad bear market, then your safe withdrawal rate actually goes up because we're going to come out of that bear market eventually, and we're going to have some great returns. And he actually looked at the correlation between the Shiller PE and the safe withdrawal rate, and they're highly correlated. And so what does that mean for us today? Well, unfortunately, it probably means we're closer to 4% than we are 10%. But the idea is we can use valuations to at least have some rough idea. However, I think, and by the way, Bengen put out an article this year in 2020, kind of doing the same thing with inflation rates and other things, and spoke very highly of the work that Kitces did. So, I mean, I think it's pretty well researched. But I think there is a sort of I don't want to call it a better approach, but a more practical approach to all of this. And it's probably something that, well, I'll certainly use it if I need to. The reason I say that is right now, we could live off far less than 4%. So I suppose that's the ideal strategy. If you can do that, then you really don't have to worry about any of this, right? I mean, one of the things Bengen's analysis found, and this will be relevant for you guys that want to retire early, is that at about 3 to 3.5%, every portfolio from 1926 to 1976 lasted 50 years. So if you're at 3.5%, certainly a 3% withdrawal rate in year one, you got 50 years, but even based on the worst case scenario. Could we encounter something even worse? Yes, that's sort of a given. We all know that. But he found 3.5% going to last you 50 years, even if you retire right before the market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression, the terrible markets in the late 30s, late 60s, right before stagflation of the 70s and all of that, 3 to 3.5%, you're going to last 50 years. Okay. But for those who are retired at a traditional age, what are our options? And this is where we get into what are called dynamic spending rules. If you think about what Bengen did, by adjusting withdrawals each year, what he's trying to do is keep your spending level constant on an inflation-adjusted basis. The dollar amount goes up, assuming we have inflation, but the purchasing power stays the same. At least he uses CPI, Consumer Price Index. Some argue, by the way, that doesn't really truly mirror our actual increases in costs. Some say it's about 1 to 1.5% too high. That's a whole different issue. But let's assume for the moment it's fairly accurate. On a spending power basis, adjusting for inflation, you have an even inflation-adjusted spending every year through retirement. What some have pointed out, though, is, well, is that really necessary? What we find is that most folks spend more in the early years of retirement than in the later years. There are certain expenses that go up later in retirement, like healthcare, but we're not traveling as much. We're not going out to eat as much. We're not traveling the world as much. Again, this is a generality. Maybe you're going to travel into your 90s, but for most people, spending actually goes down. And so does it really make sense to try to come up with a spending plan where we keep it on an inflation basis, the same every year in retirement? And maybe it doesn't. But you have these dynamic spending rules, and what they do is they do a couple of things. One, they alert you if you happen to retire in 1966, right? You don't know that in 1966. And by the way, in really bad markets, you might not know for 10 or 15 or even 20 years that you happen to retire in a dud year like 1966. The really bad markets of the early 70s actually reached back 20 years to folks that retired 2 decades ago and affected the longevity of their portfolio. This is something that Bengen specifically found in his paper in 1990. He talked about it. That doesn't get a lot of attention. It's really an article worth reading. So it can reach back a long time. So you might not know for a while if you've retired in 1966 or 1877. So dynamic spending rules help you make those sort of mid-course adjustments, and they can be very simple. I'll give you one example. Is you follow the 4% rule. And in fact, I think following these dynamic spending rules, you could probably safely go to 5%. I will add a caveat to that. I am working on a bunch of data analysis so that I can build a tool that allows me to model all of this based on actual data. I hope to have it done by the end of the year. So take all of this with a grain of salt. But imagine instead of 4%, you started with 5%. And again, you say, well, wait a minute, Rob, what if I retire in 1966 and I don't know it? Well, this is where the dynamic spending rules come in. You're going to adjust for inflation every year with one big caveat. The adjustment will never be more than 6%. Now, right now, that doesn't seem like a big sacrifice. Can you imagine 6% inflation? Well, I can, actually. I mean, if you're old like me, you certainly can imagine it. If you're young, probably not. But, if we hit inflation of 10%, you're only going to increase by 6%. That guards you against the terrible effect high inflation can have on a portfolio following the 4% rule, because that was the problem in the 70s. You're taking a 15% increase in a given year while markets are going down. It's like a double whammy. And so this very simple spending rule, cap your adjustments at 6%, will protect you from that. Of course, you may have to cut back, depending on your circumstances. It may not be easy for a couple of years. Hopefully inflation above 6% doesn't last for very long, but you never know. So that's one very simple approach. Another approach is to use what they call our guardrails. So the idea might be, again, let's say you start at 5%. But what you're going to do is each year, your total, let me put it this way. Each year you'll adjust for inflation, but you'll never take out more than 6% of your portfolio. So whatever money you've got left, you'll never take out more than 6%. So if we have a 15% inflation and you did the math and the result of your distribution would have been 7% of your portfolio, you'd back it down until it's only 6%. Or maybe inflation's tame, but the market just tanks by 50%. And so even with just a small inflation increase, it takes you to whatever, 6.5% of your portfolio. Now you'll bring it down to 6. Now you can put guardrails on the other side too, because one of the issues with the 4% rule is that you're just as likely, if you follow it, to die with 6 times the amount of money you started with as you are to go broke, right? And that makes sense because remember, the 4% rule is the worst case scenario. So you could have a guardrail on the other side that says, I'll always take out at least 4%. And so let's say the markets just go sky high, inflation is practically zero. You'd figure out your distribution for the year and it's only 3.5% of your portfolio. You could actually bump it up to 4% if you wanted to. Now, the caveat there is I wouldn't spend money just to spend it. Maybe you don't need 4% of your portfolio. But the idea of the guardrails is to protect you from, at the high end, spending too much, and at the low end, being too miserly. That's maybe not the right word, but making too many sacrifices that if you knew better, you wouldn't make. And so this is a sort of a spending policy that Kitces came up with, although he didn't include historical data on how it works out along the lines of what Bengen did for the 4% rule. In my mind, intellectually, I think it makes all kinds of sense. And it's something that, again, I'm going to model with data once I have it. But that's the idea. Now, one last thing before I bring this podcast episode in for a landing. What I've just described generally, dynamic spending rules, are not new. Endowments use them. Think about a university endowment. First of all, unlike retirement, it's supposed to last forever, right? Unlike us, it's not supposed to die. And so that's one thing. The second thing is they have the same sort of tension that we have in retirement. Because in retirement, it's kind of like we want to spend as much as we can today, but we want to make sure we have money for tomorrow, right? When endowment's the same way. They want to give as much as they can to current scholars without taking money from future scholars. On the other hand, they don't want to save too much for future scholars at the sacrifice of current scholars. It's that tension that's identical in retirement. And so what I think virtually every endowment that I've studied, and I've studied a few, I know, I need to get a life. Anyway, they use dynamic spending rules. And probably the best known one is from Yale. And they actually have it's actually, if you Google Yale spending rule, you'll find lots of information on it. And they take a slightly different approach, and their approach has changed from year to year. But what they'll do is for the current year's distributions, those say take 70% of last year's spending and adjust it for inflation. And that represents a chunk of current year spending. And then the other 30% they'll derive based on the value of their endowment. So if endowment's gone down because the market's gone down, that 30% chunk will get smaller. And if maybe the market's gone sky high, maybe that 30% could get bigger. It's calculated based on sort of an initial withdrawal rate, like we've talked about. And sometimes, rather than just using the portfolio balance at the end of the previous year, sometimes they'll take an average of, say, the last 3 years. But in that way, they kind of keep some consistency from year to year with the 70%. But they also address the market realities where their endowment balance has gone up or down with that 30%. It's certainly an approach one could use in retirement. For me, it's probably a little more complex than I'd like, although truthfully, it's not hard to make the calculation. And in fact, I've done some research and writing on that topic as well, but again, maybe for another day. So where do I come out on all of this? Well, my first goal will be to have a spending rate that's so low, I don't need to worry about any of this. Say 3% or less. That's my number one. That's plan A, right? Plan B for me will definitely be dynamic spending rules. I am leaning towards the guardrail, and I'm more concerned about the top than I am the bottom, but where I do inflation adjustments, but not exceed, say, 6% of the portfolio. Once I have all the data modeling done, which I said is going to take me some time, I'll share that with you in a future podcast. And I'm going to try to put together a tool. If there are any programmers out there, maybe Rails, or I don't know what would be the best. I'd want to put it online, but anyone that might want to work on that project with me, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Probably the best way to reach me would be through Facebook, or send me a message on Twitter. It's at Robert_A_Burger. I really need to come up. That's the other thing you help me with. I need a good Twitter handle. Robert_A_Burger. I mean, it just makes me look so old. It's like, and I know I am, but I got to do better than that. I wanted something like Financial Freedom Guy, but it's too long. Anyway, I need lots of help, and I will welcome it from all of you. Well, maybe more than John imagined when he asked this question. Do I have his name right? I've kind of forgotten. Yes, John. Thank you for your question. I hope this answers it. Maybe it was more than you wanted. I don't know. But as you can tell, I really love this stuff. And if you have any questions, the best way, join the Facebook group, dorler.net/Facebook group. I am in the group, even though I don't comment as much, because frankly, I don't need to. You guys answer all the questions, but I am there, happy to answer questions on this or any topics. And that's it for today. Thanks for listening and watching. And until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.